The year is 1944. For nearly 5 long years, a shadow has fallen over Europe, a darkness born of steel and fire that has consumed a continent. From the frozen plains of Russia to the sun-drenched coast of France, Hitler's Third Reich holds a continent in its iron grip. Yet, across a narrow, churning channel of water, a counter-shadow gathers. A force of unparalleled magnitude, an armada of warships, an army of over 1 million men, and the greatest invasion force in history wait for a single final word. That word is go. That word, this is not a story of generals and grand strategy, of arrows on a map. This is a story of fear and of courage, of steel-helmeted men crammed into rusty ships, of boys huddled in the bellies of transport planes, about to embark on a journey from which many would never return. This is the story of D-Day, as told through the eyes of the soldiers who lived it. The planning for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France, was a masterpiece of secrecy and meticulous detail. It was an undertaking so vast it required the collaboration of 3 nations and the coordinated efforts of hundreds of thousands of men, from logistics officers to field engineers. The Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was the architect of this grand design. For months, his headquarters in London worked in a feverish, round-the-clock state, calculating every tide, every phase of the moon, and every potential German response. The Germans, under the command of Field Marshal Rommel, knew an invasion was coming. Their intelligence indicated it would land at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Rommel had spent months fortifying the coast, building what he called the Atlantic Wall, a formidable line of bunkers, concrete pillboxes, and tank traps stretching for thousands of miles. But the Allies had created a deception so elaborate it was breathtaking. A phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, was positioned across from the Pas de Calais, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and Hollywood-style decoys to convince Hitler that the invasion would land there. While Hitler watched a ghost army, the real one was preparing to storm the beaches of Normandy. The final days before the invasion were an eternity. On June 5, 1944, the weather was foul. The sky was thick with cloud and rain, and the seas were rough. The forecast was so bad that many believed the invasion would be postponed. It had already been delayed once, a week prior. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a bayonet. But a brief break in the weather was forecasted. A small, fragile window of opportunity. It was a gamble of epic proportions, a wager of 1 million lives. That night, Eisenhower made the decision. With a grim resolve, he simply said, "Okay, let's go." The order was given, and the gears of the greatest invasion in history began to turn. For the men of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, the hours before D-Day were a blur of final preparations and nervous energy. Their mission was perhaps the most perilous of all: to jump from the sky behind enemy lines, hours before the main amphibious assault. Their objectives were crucial: to secure bridges and crossroads, to sow chaos and confusion, and to buy the infantry on the beaches a fighting chance. As they waited in the airfields of southern England, the atmosphere was a mix of quiet determination and grim humor. They taped their dog tags to silence them. They blackened their faces with charcoal to blend into the night. They joked about the weight of their gear, 100 pounds of equipment strapped to their bodies, an extra burden that would turn them into a dead weight if their parachutes failed to open. Many of them were barely out of their teens, still boys, but about to become legends. As the sun set, they loaded onto C-47 transport planes, a fleet of over 800 aircraft. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and sweat. The engines roared to life, a deafening sound that swallowed all conversation. They were flying into the unknown, a journey of a few hours that would define the rest of their lives. Below them, across the channel, an equally massive force was sailing towards the French coast. The largest armada in history, a fleet of nearly 7,000 vessels, was churning through the waves. Inside the cramped landing crafts, the infantrymen were seasick, cold, and quiet. They knew their objective. They knew the name of their beach: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, or Sword. But what they didn't know was what awaited them when the doors dropped. The sound of waves crashing against the sides of the vessels was replaced by the deafening roar of the naval bombardment as it began to unleash a storm of fire and steel upon the French coast. The men huddled together, thinking of their families and friends, or simply trying not to think at all. They could only imagine the machine guns, the barbed wire, and the brutal welcome the German defenders had prepared. The night was cold, dark, and full of unspoken prayers. But the wait was almost over. The long night would soon give way to the longest day. The invasion began not on the water but in the air. At 1:30 a.m. in the pitch-black sky over Normandy, a chilling silence was broken only by the roar of hundreds of C-47 engines. For the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, this was the moment of truth. But the flight over the English Channel was just the prelude to the chaos that awaited them. As the planes crossed the French coastline, German anti-aircraft fire, known as flak, erupted from the ground. Red and orange tracers filled the sky, turning the night into a deadly fireworks display. The sound was a symphony of destruction. The rattling of machine guns, the terrifying shriek of explosions, and the desperate shouts of pilots trying to hold their formations. The paratroopers, jammed together in the cramped fuselage, felt their planes lurch and buck as they took hits. The green light flashed, the signal to jump. In that instant, all fear gave way to action. They launched themselves into the dark void, into a storm of flak and confusion. But the German fire had scattered the planes, and the drop zones were a mess. Many paratroopers landed miles from their designated areas, alone and disoriented in the darkness. They hit the ground hard, in the middle of fields, tangled in trees, or in the worst cases, directly in German garrisons. The iconic images of paratroopers hanging lifelessly from the clock tower of Sainte-Mère-Église were a brutal reminder of the terrifying reality of their jump. Once on the ground, the war was fought in small, isolated battles in the dark. A sergeant from the 82nd Airborne might find himself with only 3 other men, surrounded by the enemy, miles from his objective. Communication was broken. They had lost their heavy equipment in the drop. Their mission, which was once a clear, plotted line on a map, was now a matter of improvisation and raw courage. They had to rely on a few simple tools: a cricket clicker to identify other American soldiers, and the unwritten rule to move towards the sound of the fight. They fought to secure crucial bridges and crossroads, to cut German communications, and to create enough chaos to distract from the coming amphibious assault. In the dead of night, they were the first wave, the shock troops who landed in the heart of the beast, battling a silent, unseen enemy. Their struggle was the bloody prelude to the main event, and their bravery bought the Allied forces on the water the precious hours they would need to prepare for the dawn of the longest day. As the sun began its slow ascent on June 6, 1944, a new, terrifying sound filled the air. It was a sound that would define the very essence of D-Day, the thunder of thousands of naval cannons. From the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers of the largest armada in history, a rain of steel and high explosives fell upon the French coast, turning the sky into an unbroken storm of fire. For the men in the landing crafts, the immense noise was both a terrifying promise of the chaos to come and a source of desperate hope. The bombardment was meant to obliterate the German defenses, to clear the path for the infantry to storm the beaches. But for the men huddled inside the bobbing, cramped vessels, the most terrifying sound was the silence that followed, just before the steel ramp of their landing craft was lowered. The 5 beaches of Normandy had 5 different names and would meet with 5 very different fates. Each beach had its own story of courage, sacrifice, and survival. At Utah Beach, the first American infantrymen were greeted by a relative sense of calm. The naval bombardment had been effective, and the German defenses, built by an inferior regiment, were not as formidable as expected. The tide was also in their favor, and the strong current had pushed the first wave of landing crafts about 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone, right into the hands of a much weaker German position. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, was the only general to land in the first wave. Seeing the error, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His courage and quick thinking turned a potential disaster into a decisive victory, and the American forces were able to secure a foothold with minimal casualties. a testament to the meticulous planning and sheer luck that had gone into their operation. At Juno and Gold Beaches, the British and Canadian forces also met with stiff resistance, but their relentless determination and the use of specialized funnies, armored tanks with flails and flamethrowers designed to clear mines and obstacles, allowed them to push inland. The fight was fierce, a brutal exchange of fire on the sand, but they were able to overcome the German defenders and begin their push into the countryside, opening crucial avenues for the rest of the invasion force. But then there was Omaha. The name itself would forever be synonymous with hell on earth. The naval bombardment meant to soften the German defenses had utterly failed. The bombs had either fallen too far inland or had no effect on the concrete bunkers. An elite German division, the 352nd Infantry Division, was positioned on the bluffs overlooking the beach. They were armed with machine guns, mortars, and artillery, and they were ready. As the American infantry hit the beach, they were met with a storm of lead so intense it was like a solid wall. Men fell in the water before their boots even touched the sand. The surf turned red with blood. Tanks were lost in the waves, and landing craft were shredded by artillery. The beach was a slaughterhouse. For hours, men were pinned down, huddled behind obstacles, unable to move forward or back. It was only through an act of sheer desperate courage that a few small groups of soldiers were able to climb the bluffs, using grenades and guts to silence the German gunners. Their sacrifice allowed the rest of the force to push forward, but the cost was astronomical. Omaha was not just a beach, it was a testament to the immense human cost of war. The fight did not end on the beaches. For the Allied soldiers who survived the initial storm of steel, a new and different kind of hell awaited them. This was the War of the Bocage, a treacherous landscape of small fields, enclosed by ancient, thick hedgerows. These earthen walls, some centuries old, were a perfect defense for the German army. They turned every field into a killing zone, a labyrinth of death where snipers and machine gun nests could hide, unseen, and ambush Allied troops as they struggled to advance. The Bocage turned the war into a close-quarters, grinding slog, a bloody affair of ambushes and endless firefights. The advance was measured in meters, not miles, and every inch of ground had to be paid for in blood. The constant tension, the unending fear of the unseen enemy, pushed the soldiers to the brink of exhaustion. The psychological toll of the fighting in the hedgerows was as brutal as the physical one. But the courage and resilience of the men of D-Day would not be broken. The relentless push through the hedgerows, the desperate fight for every town and every crossroads, was a testament to the unyielding spirit of the soldiers who fought there. They faced an enemy that was beaten but not defeated, and every day was a struggle to push them back inch by bloody inch. They secured the crucial beachhead, and in doing so, they opened the floodgates for the rest of the Allied forces to pour into France. The invasion was a success, but it was a success built on the sacrifice of thousands of men, and the battles that followed were just as fierce and deadly as the invasion itself. D-Day was not the end of the war. In many ways, it was just the beginning, but it was a turning point. It was the moment the tide finally turned, the day the hope of a continent was placed on the shoulders of a generation of young men who charged into an inferno to set the world free. They came from across the sea, armed with steel and driven by a fire that would not be extinguished. They changed history forever. The story of D-Day is not just a tale of grand strategy or military might. It is a story of human courage, a testament to the bravery of ordinary men who, when faced with the extraordinary, did not hesitate. Their legacy lives on not just in the history books, but in the echoes of their courage that resound in the fields and beaches of Normandy.